Thanks so much for joining this session this afternoon. It's good to have you around. My name is Olga, and I'm doing my PhD with the Open University Business School, and I'm one of the co-organizers for this conference. I'm very excited to join this session and to chair it, particularly by the opportunity to learn a lot about new materials perspective and this material rebooting on leadership. Things I am really interested in, and I'm looking forward to hear our research on inclusive leadership materiality, and then a paper applying the ethics of care to leadership. The first research is presented by Gemma and Cinzia, and I will stop now and looking forward. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Okay, so I'm Dr. Gemma Bend. So I'm an early career lecturer at the University of Huddersfield in the Business School. I actually did my PhD at the Open University, so it's nice to be back seeing colleagues. So this is a paper that I have, we're in the process of co-authoring with Cinzia Priola. She's also in the room. So I'm going to be doing the presentation, and Cinzia is going to jump in and help with sort of Q&A at the end. So the topic we're looking at today then is inclusive leadership. So we're looking at a relational materialist analysis of the experience of the leader-followership relationship among disabled workers. So as we've got a small amount of time, I'm just sort of going to move quickly through sort of the idea of what inclusion is. So inclusion from our research is about this idea of welcoming and valuing people's differences. So it's about building partnerships between a two-way process. So between a leader and the follower in the context of leadership for this paper. So it's about having access to information and resources required to do the jobs. So that's things such as accommodations in the workplace for disabled employees. And it's also about this idea of psychological safety. So do people feel safe to express their identity? So disclosing their disability, for instance. So what we're sort of grounding on, and I will say that this idea of inclusive leadership, it's an area that's new to myself. So I am looking for sort of any insights and any suggestions that you could make as an audience to this presentation. So if anyone has any sort of comments or suggestions, please feel free to share at the end. So inclusive leadership then, on the basis of what we're looking at then, it's about forms of communication, and it's about how do leaders sort of make and get contributions from a diverse workforce, and how they sort of allow people from a diverse background to get involved in decision-making processes. So what we liked about inclusive leadership then is that it is a relational leadership approach. So it focuses on the leader and the relationship with the followers. But what we wanted to stress, and how we're pushing it beyond the literature that's out there now, is that the relational approach is specific to that interaction between the leader and the follower. But what we're saying is it needs to go further than that. You need to look at the material relational encounters with objects and other sort of inorganic matter. So how does materiality, place, space, furniture, for instance, within a particular place, how does that affect the experience of disability within the workplace? So that's sort of how we're coming about this paper. So inclusive leadership then, so it's all about how we can get people's voices and perspectives in that might otherwise be absent for people from a diverse background. So what we're trying to do then in this paper, that we're trying to sort of challenge the traditional managerial material-based views of leadership. So how are human bodies, so leaders and followers, how they're used as commodities to control for profit. So very much work draws on neoliberal capitalism and looking at how bodies are used as a commodity to control for profit. So people from, it might not be aware of disability research, people with disabilities are not valued as much with traditional managerial approaches because they're not as productive, they can't work as fast and as hard as able-bodied people, so they're not seen as valued. But what we're saying then, that this is counterproductive in a diverse world of work. So the way in which we are engaging with work, the world of work is changing. So what we're trying to do then is really draw on a critical perspective of inclusive leadership. And how we're doing that is we're grounding it within a social material and post-humanist approach, which looks at the relationship between bodies, objects, space, and how power controls these. So we're drawing on the work of people like Karen Barad and Rosie Bradotti. So social materiality then, so this is the network of human and material practices. It looks at how discourse as phenomena and sort of material practices, they act as a togetherness. So the social and the material then are not separate entities, they're inseparable, and they're co-constituted in relational practices. So I just wanted a little diagram just to show that it's what we're saying between matter and discourse then. It's not one has an impact on the other, it is unidirectional, so matter has an impact on discourse, discourse has an impact on matter. So that's what we look through in the data that we have analysed. So new materialism then looks at this challenging this idea of the subject and the object, nature and culture as sort of separate entities. We're saying that they are inseparable. So we are drawing on feminist scholars, as I say, such as Karen Barad, who argue that everything, including inorganic matter, can have the agentic capabilities to affect knowing and being. So agency, we are moving away from a humanist approach to agency. So we're saying that inorganic matter can have a relational affect on bodies, and we'll look at this in a little bit of detail about how it comes through in the data. So moving on to talk about a new materialist leadership perspective then. So leadership then is a relational construct that is performed through the intra-action, so the relational inseparability of matter, bodies, discourse and space. So whereas traditional leadership has looked at the interaction, so the relationship between bodies, so the leader and the follower, what we're saying is that doesn't go far enough. We need to look at how matter, inorganic matter, discourse and space, how that has an impact on the leader-follower relationship. So we're looking at sort of a leader-follower materiality sort of link rather than just a leader-follower. We're pushing it a bit further. So we're looking then at how power and politics control spaces and the bodies within that. So Roppo and Silvara, so some of the papers that we've looked at that actually do look at materiality and leadership then. So they argue that leadership from a new materialist point of view can come into being. So it looks at the felt experiences of the physical spaces. So they distinguish between place and space. So when they talk about place, they're talking about material places such as office, they're talking about stairs, desks, and then the difference between place and space is about the subjective and the embodied experience of material places. And it's about how places and spaces can actually construct and perform leadership, and how it can act as a substitute for individual leaders. So material place can be performative. So we'll look at an example of that in the data that we've got coming through. It's very preliminary at this point, but we have found some examples that are coming through in my previous PhD data. So the main research questions that we're looking at then, so it's, do sheltered workshops leaders adopt a more inclusive leadership style than mainstream employment leaders? And the second question is, how can a new materialist perspective theoretically advance an inclusive leadership approach to managing disability in the workplace? So I'll just go into a bit more detail about what the actual research project was. So this was a project, it was my PhD project that explored the experiences of disabled people across different work settings in the UK. So I looked at two separate studies. So study A was an ethnographic study, which included participant observations over 11 months. So I went to a charity-based manufacturing workshop and I worked alongside workers on the shop floor, saw what they were doing, getting involved. I was working there on a sort of daily basis. I went once or twice a week over those 11 months. And then I followed that up with 12 semi-structured interviews with both the workers and management team at this workshop. So the workshop was quite small, about 40, 50 people, but on a given day there was probably about 20 people there. And this was a workshop that largely employed disabled individuals. So there were some able-bodied people that worked there as well, but it was primarily, the focus was about disabled employees. So that was people had learning difficulties, some people who were deaf, some people who had physical disabilities. It was very varied. It wasn't one particular type of disability. Study B then, so I wanted to compare the experiences then of people in sheltered employment, what their experiences were in mainstream as well. So I interviewed 12 disabled workers in mainstream employment. So that was across a number of different sectors. So we had a lecturer, shop floor worker, electrical engineer. It was so varied, the type of organisations that we had, but I really wanted to get a feel for how the leadership and the organisations engage with the individual with their disabilities and what their experiences of that were. So what we looked then to the data analysis. So we used NVivo to organise the data. So that's where I put, when I typed the interviews up, that's where we put it into there and tried to organise it. And then we applied a new materialist perspective onto the data to explore this idea of leadership and followership in relation to inclusion. So what I'm going to do with the rest of the time then is go through some of the findings and apply it back to inclusive leadership and a new materials perspective. So one of the things we looked at was the actions of the leaders. So one of the sort of sub-themes then of this was this idea of awareness or unawareness of oppressive practices. So the management team in the sheltered workshop all had disabilities, and they stressed that was a really key part of what worked well in this organisation, because they understood the struggle of how they understood from the point of view of being disabled on their own embodied experiences of how difficult it can be to get people to accept that you can do the job. But I thought this contrasted quite nicely to what I experienced whilst I was actually doing the participant observation. So I've got a quick example here from a field note. So Joyce, the manager, stated that she didn't mind Mark being a little bit slower, but as she had managed to fold 5 bags to his 1, she told him that he needed to pick up the pace or the job won't get finished. She told him to stand up as that might help. So we were sat down on a table folding bags, and she realised that he was working quite a bit slower than she was. But what I thought was quite interesting, that she'd, rather than using this inclusive approach, she went back to more of an autocratic leadership's approach, where she was telling him what to do, but she was also picking up on how if he moved his body into a different position from sat down to stood up, he might have been able to work in a more efficient manner. So she was kind of realizing how the physical environment and his interaction with his body could change. It could impact his productivity. And I thought that contrasted quite nicely. She was saying, we do so expect them to be pushing themselves to achieve the best they can, but it's them imposing onto the individual of what they think they can do, as opposed to what the individual wants to do. So one of the other themes that was coming through then, if we look at some of the differences between mainstream and sheltered, was this idea of disclosure and employee performance. Sharon was a health advisor in the NHS, and she disclosed that she had a disability when she first went into the workplace, and she felt that they were really understanding, they're really good at accommodating her disability, and she was the best manager that she's ever had. But later on, she contradicted this by saying that she felt that she was being wrapped up in cotton wool, and that it's been told that she can't do certain things or certain trainings, and she was feeling sort of held back because they don't want her to be off again. But what I thought was quite interesting then was this idea of the leaders were imposing their own opinions of what her body can do, and they were limiting what she was actually doing in the workplace to prevent her from being off, because they knew that she was a resource to be used within that organisation, and if she was off, then that organisation wasn't going to run as effectively. So that I thought that was quite interesting, that they were trying to stop her from getting involved with various things that she thought she had the capability to do. So there was that lack of two-way dialogue there. She wasn't able to push back and say, well, hang on a minute, I actually can do this. One of the contrasting then with the sheltered was that the leadership team were actually saying that they sit with the people and mentor them to get the best that they can do. So it was very much a transformational leadership style of what can we do to help improve this person and get them to meet the goals of the organisation in a much more inclusive manner. So that was some of the differences that was coming through. And as one of the parts of inclusive leadership then is about this idea of valuing and supporting diversity. So that did come through in the organisation. So that came through in both the shop floor workers and the leadership team. And they felt that they could work to the best of their capability, although we've shown that it wasn't always the case. And they felt that, especially the leadership team, they were talking about feeling far more attached to the organisation and responsible to the organisation because they had that inclusive, supportive environment that was coming through from the board of directors, and then the leadership team were trickling that down into the shop floor workers as well. And that contrasted quite nicely to the mainstream, who felt like they had to work 200% of their ability in order to keep up with this idea of the norm of an able-bodied person working in an organisation. They felt they had to work as hard and as fast as other people. And of course, when we talk about this idea of materiality then, what I thought was quite interesting in all the data that was coming through, all of them were getting some form of material support from the organisation, particularly because of the legal requirements. But that didn't trickle through in terms of moral support. What was really important then was that they didn't feed back what they were adding to the material support, what impact did that have on the individual, and what could they do to sort of improve their experiences. So Sarah, for instance, she had spina bifida, she struggled to walk, she had all this equipment she had to bring in every day, and she was struggling. So they give her a trolley bag, but she actually couldn't physically get it up the stairs. People had to be lifting this bag up, bringing it into the office every day, but the leadership team didn't actually try and implement any changes to improve that experience. So that was an example of how the physical environment and material objects can actually constrain the experience of disabled people in the workplace, and how the leadership team can almost ignore the moral support that they can offer employees. So just to finish off then, so leaders need to enact a more sort of consistent inclusive leadership style, because there were some contradictions coming through in the way in which they both challenge and enact oppressive practices. And what we're looking at then is this idea of leader follower material dynamics and how it can strain performance. So what we are suggesting then is it's important that leaders consider the ongoing material and moral support that's needed, and consider how matter and discourse do interact to affect work experiences and performativity. Okay, I appreciate that was a very much whistle-stop tour on the paper, so I'm very happy to answer any questions if people want to know a bit more about the data. If anyone's got any suggestions, I'm more than happy to take them on board. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gemma. I think that was a wonderful talk. We have quite an audience here. I would love to take some questions now. If you wish, you can use the chat box to put your questions in the chat, or to raise your hand and ask this question out loud. When people are thinking about the questions to be asked, I have a little bit of the reflection on this topic, because I thought that a lot of this leadership style would be really defined by the matter of thought through and outspoken and negotiated expectations about one's work in the organization. And I realized that discussing, negotiating these expectations and talking and seeing others, this is a very, very important part of the process. And I also was thinking about the way how these negotiations would also have the material aspect in it, in a way. So what you can comment on the role of this, the role of expectations for choosing the particular, or not just choosing, probably intuitively choosing or just following a specific leadership style in this, in the case of your research.
So we've chosen this inclusive leadership style to look at more broader, because it fits in more with the equality, diversity and inclusion approach of what we're looking at, the whole ethos of the project. And what I'm starting to look at a bit more now, as I say, I'm quite new to this area of leadership. So what I'm looking at is contrasting as a inclusive leadership style that the organisation, particularly the sheltered, sort of imposed that they were doing, and how in reality, in practice, they were actually adopting quite varied and different leadership styles. As I said, sometimes it was an autocratic style, telling them what they should and shouldn't do. And what that changed was it's very context dependent. So when the organisation was ahead of their sort of priorities and things were going well, and they were meeting their production timelines, they were adopting a more inclusive leadership style. As soon as things started to get off track and they were sort of, we're not going to meet this deadline, then they went to a more autocratic style of, you need to work faster, you need to work harder, and there was a lot less tolerance to individual differences. It was very much back to the you are a tool to meet profits.
Yeah, great, thank you. Victor has a question. Victor, please go on.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I'm also studying the materiality of leadership, and this is more like a reflection / question from my side. Is that recently I read that disability is less about people, but it's more about environment. So it is the surroundings of us that disable people rather than the opposite. That means that if you don't have access to a building, it is the building that it is disabling you as a human being. So do you have any sort of reflections about the role of materiality in disabling people?
Yeah, so there's sort of different models of disability. So the social model of disability is very much looking at it's the society, it's the environment that leads to the disabling part. But what I draw on is the social relational model of disability. So what that does then, it draws on how both the material and the body, what's happening within the body, can lead to a disability. So you could have a fully accessible work environment that actually can allow you to be in that organisation. But if you are physically and mentally exhausted, or you're experiencing pain, that can have an impact then on your ability to actually use that environment and use it well. So there is, at different times, there are both within the individual, what's going on, the embodied experience, regardless of what's going on in the physical environment, that can actually lead to being disabling and a barrier to their employment participation.
Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks. Nick has a question.
Hi there, thank you, Gemma. Really interesting presentation. My first comment is inclusive leadership just rhetorical? But I think my main sort of kind of reflection, I mean, new materialism is quite radical. It's incredibly radical, and it's decentering the human to an incredible degree. So the question is then, how do we write about this from a perspective of presentations or papers? Because often we can default, say, to our interview data, we're talking about people experiencing things within environment. And new materialists probably say go a bit further, we need to decenter that kind of language. And I think it's been quite a struggle. I think Jane Bennett in one of her books tries to write from the perspective of rubbish or a rat, I think, at one point. And actually raised a real challenge for how we write about things when we do such radical decentering. So what are your thoughts, reflections, and how we go about doing that?
Oh God, that is such a, to be honest, it's something I've struggled with quite a bit, because we are constrained by our language, because it's the way in which the medium we use to get our data across. So I fully take that point on board, and Cinzia, you can jump in if you've got any sort of thoughts on that. But it is difficult, yes. So when I was doing my data collection, I was actually in the environment. I was really trying to think about not only what I was seeing and interpreting, but it was also about how I was feeling as well, and what the physical environment was doing to me. So it was things like, how did you sit down on a chair, for instance, and it was, how does my body interact with that material world, but how do I get that across in my in the way in which I present the data, because it was something that was felt within me, but how do I share that experience through the medium of language? And it was how, so for instance, I was sat in a chair and I was very uncomfortable. It was like a wooden stool, and I was working, and I didn't even realize I was doing it. I was uncomfortable. I was shifting on the chair. I was stretching and stuff. And someone who was deaf noticed and came and tapped him on the shoulder. I started pointing at the chair and then holding me back, because he recognized that physically I was in distress, and he was pointing to a more comfortable chair, and he wanted me to sort of swap the chair. And I thought that was a nice example that how I hadn't spoken anything, but the way in which my body was interacting and obviously visually giving off cues that I wasn't interacting with that work environment very well. I just thought that was a nice example of how the spoken word is different from what can be seen and observed. So I don't have a full answer to that, but just an example to draw on from the data.
I think Nick, another thing that Gemma and I discussed while we were discussing this paper, when you put in the leadership into the mix, it gets even more complicated, because and I suppose, you know, we are talking about a relational perspective, or we're trying to push the relational perspective. So there is no leader, there is no followers, you know, there is all, you know, the interaction is really what we want to look at, despite the fact that this sort of, we keep being pulled by, you know, the language of the leader and followers, but then it's us choosing. So what type of leadership Gemma and I are exercising in choosing, in giving voice, in bringing certain elements to the paper. So yeah, we said we're to push even the leadership aspect for, because we are exercising leadership in this interaction, because we are part of, you know, Gemma was part of the interaction as a participant, but then I come in, you know, in the writing as well. And therefore, you know, what you're saying is very much complicated when we brought leadership as well. So yeah, we are still battling with all this.
Yeah, it's not easy.
Thank you so much for your questions. If you don't mind, we'll move on to the next speaker. That was a fantastic research, and thanks a lot for sharing. I will be thinking a lot about the dynamics of the leadership and the context within it happens. So many things we really need to consider, as such a complexity in the topic, definitely moving us away from this strong man leadership for sure. Thanks so much, Gemma. Thanks so much, Cinzia.